The first gust hit Thomas's face like a slap, carrying with it the familiar scent of impending rain. Standing at the edge of his property, he watched the saplings he planted 3 years ago bend and sway against the gathering storm. 42 trees, aspen, spruce, and pine, arranged in a careful line along the northwestern perimeter of his land. 3 years of patient watering, fertilizing, and protecting them from deer. 3 years of watching them transform from vulnerable twigs into the beginnings of a proper windbreak. He smiled as the wind picked up again. The young trees danced but held firm. They were working, already cutting the wind's force by nearly half compared to the open space beyond them. His house, garden, and patio would be protected from the worst of the prairie winds that howled across this part of Colorado for much of the year. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Thomas turned back toward his modest ranch-style home. The dark clouds massing on the horizon suggested he had maybe an hour before the storm hit in earnest. Plenty of time to secure the patio furniture and check the weather stripping on the doors and windows. As he walked up his gravel driveway, the metallic clang of a car door closing caught his attention. A gleaming white SUV had parked at the curb, its chrome wheels and trim catching what little sunlight remained. Thomas suppressed a groan as Diane Harrington emerged, clipboard in hand, her platinum blonde hair sprayed into rigid submission despite the wind. "Mr. Ellis," she called out, her voice carrying that particular pitch of forced pleasantness that always set his teeth on edge. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Thomas forced a polite smile. "Just preparing for the storm, Mrs. Harrington. What can I do for you today?" Diane was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, a position she held for the past 7 years through what Thomas suspected was a combination of intimidation and the fact that nobody else wanted the job. She approached with quick, purposeful steps, her tailored pantsuit immaculate as always. "Well, I'm afraid I'm here on official HOA business," she said, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "It's about those trees you've planted along your property line." Thomas blinked. "My windbreak? What about it?" "I've received several complaints from neighbors about how it obstructs the natural view corridor outlined in our community bylaws." Diane held up a printout of what appeared to be a satellite image of the neighborhood with red circles around Thomas's tree line. "According to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our covenants, no vegetation shall exceed 4 feet in height within designated view corridors." "That can't be right," Thomas said, the first flickers of anger warming his chest. "I specifically checked the HOA guidelines before planting those trees. There's nothing about a view corridor on my property." Diane's smile tightened fractionally. "The board voted to update the bylaws last month. The notification was included in the April newsletter." She pulled out another sheet of paper. "Here's the formal notice. Those trees need to be removed within 30 days or you'll face daily fines of $100. Thomas took the paper, reading the official letterhead with growing disbelief. "This is absurd. Those trees have been growing for 3 years. Nobody's complained before now. Rules are rules, Mr. Ellis." Diane's voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. "Perhaps if you attended our monthly meetings, you'd have had the opportunity to voice your concerns before the vote." Another gust of wind, stronger than before, blew across the yard, sending a plastic planter skittering across Thomas's driveway. In the distance, the trees bent but continued to shield his property from the worst of it. "Diane, those trees are a windbreak. They protect my house and my yard from wind damage. With the way the storms have been getting worse every year." "Not my problem," Diane cut in. "The view corridor affects property values for the entire neighborhood. Your personal landscaping preferences don't supersede community standards." Thomas could feel his blood pressure rising. "My personal landscaping preferences are practical measures to protect my property. Your house is on the other side of the neighborhood. How does my windbreak affect your view in any way?" "It's not about my view specifically," Diane said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a child. "It's about maintaining the aesthetic standards that make Whispering Pines desirable. The board's decision is final." As they stood facing each other, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering the driveway between them with dark circles. "This conversation isn't over," Thomas said quietly. "You're right," Diane replied, retreating toward her SUV. "You have 29 days left to comply." Thunder cracked overhead as Thomas sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers. The storm had intensified through the evening, rain lashing against the windows while his windbreak trees bent but didn't break, reducing the wind's assault on his home. Every gust that didn't rattle his windows reminded him exactly what was at stake. He'd spent hours combing through the HOA bylaws, amendments, and meeting minutes from the past year. The more he read, the more his suspicion grew. According to the HOA's own rules, bylaw changes required a 2/3 majority vote from homeowners, not just the board. Yet the minutes from last month's meeting, which he pulled from the neighborhood website, showed only 7 people in attendance, the 5 board members and 2 regular homeowners. Thomas reached for his phone and opened the neighborhood's private Facebook group. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing. Asterisk attention Whispering Pines neighbors. Has anyone else received notice about view corridor violations from the HOA? I'm trying to understand how a major bylaw change was approved without the required community vote. Please message me if you've been affected. Asterisk. He hit post, then walked to the window. The storm was peaking now, the wind driving sheets of rain sideways against his house. Beyond his line of trees, he could see debris tumbling across the open space, branches, trash cans, even someone's patio umbrella that had torn loose from its base. His phone buzzed within minutes, then again and again. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving puddles in the street and scattered branches across yards, but nothing catastrophic. Thomas' inbox, however, was flooded. 17 neighbors had responded to his post, 12 of them unaware of any bylaw change regarding view corridors. 5 mentioned receiving similar notices about various violations in the past month: overgrown hedges, unapproved garden structures, fence heights. After coffee and a quick survey of his property, no damage thanks largely to his windbreak, Thomas called the one person he knew would give him straight answers: Eleanor Greenberg, who had served on the HOA board before Diane took over. At 83, Eleanor had lived in Whispering Pines longer than anyone and held no reservations about speaking her mind. Of course it's not legal, Eleanor said when Thomas explained the situation. Her voice crackled through the phone, sharp and clear despite her age. That one has been making up rules since she got that ridiculous title. The proper procedure is written right in the founding documents. So what can I do? Thomas asked, pacing his kitchen. Document everything. Get your neighbors involved, and don't you dare touch those trees. They've saved half the neighborhood from wind damage over the years. Eleanor paused. You know why she's really after your trees, don't you? Thomas stopped pacing. No, why? Her nephew just started a landscaping business. Guess who got the contract for all HOA-mandated removals and replacements? The Pete's clicked into place. Thomas thanked Eleanor and immediately began writing emails to his neighbors, to a lawyer friend for a consultation, and to the county extension office to request an evaluation of his windbreak's environmental benefits. By afternoon, he organized an informal neighborhood meeting for the following evening at his house. He was preparing talking points when the doorbell rang. Martin Chen from 4 houses down stood on the porch looking uncomfortable. I saw your post, Martin said, glancing over his shoulder. Look, you should know that Diane's furious. She was at Starbucks this morning telling the other board members that you're undermining community harmony or some nonsense. Thomas invited him in. I'm just asking questions about proper procedure. Martin shook his head. She's calling an emergency board meeting tonight. I had overheard her saying they need to make an example before others get the same idea. Thanks for the warning, Thomas said. Will you come to my meeting tomorrow? Martin hesitated. My wife doesn't want to get involved. We're trying to sell next spring, and Diane's threatened to withhold approval for exterior modifications if people oppose her. Thomas nodded, understanding. Not everyone could afford to take a stand. After Martin left, Thomas decided to see exactly what he was up against. He drove slowly through the neighborhood, noting houses with similar landscaping issues that had gone unaddressed. The pattern was clear. Enforcement was selective at best. As he grounded the corner onto Diane's street, he slowed further. Her house was unmistakable, the largest in the development with elaborate landscaping and a 3-car garage. What caught Thomas' attention, however, was the row of Italian cypress trees along her own property line, easily 20 feet tall and definitely within what would be considered a view corridor. Thomas woke before his alarm, the gray light of dawn barely filtering through his bedroom window. He slept poorly, his dreams filled with chainsaws and falling trees. A quick check of his weather app confirmed what the meteorologists had been warning about for days. A major storm system was developing over the mountains, potentially the strongest of the season, expected to hit within 48 hours. By 7:30, he'd already set up a folding table at the edge of his driveway with coffee, donuts, and printouts of the HOA bylaws highlighting the sections Diane had violated. A laminated map of the neighborhood showed the inconsistent enforcement of the view corridor rule, with red circles around properties, including Diane's, where similar or more extreme violations had gone unaddressed. At 8:15, exactly as promised, a white van with a Channel 7 logo pulled up and a reporter and cameraman emerged. Thomas recognized the reporter, Alicia Mendez, from her series on HOA overreach. Mr. Ellis, she extended her hand. Thanks for reaching out. Mind if we get some establishing shots of the trees while you fill me in on the details? By 8:30, 5 neighbors had arrived, parking their cars strategically along the street. Eleanor Greenberg was among them, leaning on her cane but standing defiantly beside Thomas' property line. Martin Chen had come after all, though he kept checking his phone nervously. At 8:45, a county truck pulled in, and a woman in a Department of Environmental Services uniform introduced herself as Dr. Petal. I can't stay for your confrontation, she explained, handing Thomas an official-looking document. But this certifies that your windbreak constitutes a beneficial environmental installation that reduces erosion, provides wildlife habitat, and mitigates wind damage. The county encourages such installations, particularly in high-wind areas like yours. Thomas thanked her, adding the certificate to his growing stack of evidence. At precisely 9 o'clock, the rumble of heavy trucks announced the arrival of Greenscape Solutions, 3 vehicles including a wood chipper and a truck loaded with what appeared to be replacement shrubs. Magnetic signs on the doors featured a logo that Thomas had seen before on Diane's nephew's social media. Behind them, Diane's white SUV pulled up, and she emerged looking immaculate in a beige pantsuit, her expression souring as she took in the assembled group and the news van. The lead contractor, a burly man with a close-cropped beard, approached Thomas with a clipboard. "I've got an order to remove 40-plus trees from this property line." He glanced at the gathered crowd. "Is there a problem here?" Before Thomas could respond, Alicia Mendez stepped forward, microphone in hand, camera rolling. "Sir, are you aware that the homeowner disputes the legality of this removal order, and that there may be a conflict of interest in the contract assignment?" The contractor blinked, looking from the reporter to Thomas to Diane, who was now striding toward them, her face flushed. "Stop filming immediately," Diane demanded, putting her hand in front of the camera. "This is a private HOA matter." "Actually," Alicia replied smoothly, stepping back, "this is a public street, and there's significant community interest in how HOA boards enforce their rules, especially when family connections might be involved." "What family connections?" the contractor asked, frowning. Eleanor Greenberg tapped her cane on the pavement. "Oh, don't play dumb, Tyler. Everyone knows you're Diane's nephew. My granddaughter went to high school with you." Tyler's discomfort was visible now. "Look, I'm just here to do a job that was contracted through proper channels." Thomas stepped forward, handing Tyler the cease and desist letter his lawyer had emailed. "These are not proper channels, and these trees are staying where they are until a full homeowner vote can be conducted according to our bylaws." "This is ridiculous," Diane snapped, grabbing the letter. "The board has full authority to enforce community standards." "The board has authority to enforce existing standards," Thomas corrected her, "not to create new ones without proper procedure." More neighbors were arriving now, drawn by the commotion and the news van. Many had responded to an early morning text chain organized by Eleanor. Tyler was checking his phone, apparently receiving messages. He turned to Diane. "Aunt D, I think we should postpone this job. My business can't afford this kind of publicity." "Your business can afford to lose the HOA contract either," Diane hissed, but the camera caught every word. The community center was packed by 6:45 p.m. Thomas found his seat near the back, nodding to neighbors he'd come to know better through the day's events. The room buzzed with conversation, partly about the morning's confrontation and Diane's sudden resignation, but mostly about the approaching storm. Richard Harrington, looking more casual in jeans and a sweater than he had that morning, stood at the front with members of the county emergency management team. A large map of Whispering Pines was projected on the wall behind them, with colored zones indicating evacuation priorities if needed. Conspicuously absent was Diane. Based on current projections, the lead emergency manager was saying this system will hit us tomorrow around 4 p.m. We're looking at sustained winds of 60 to 70 mph for at least 3 hours, with gusts potentially exceeding 90 miles per hour. A murmur ran through the crowd. Colorado saw strong winds regularly, but rarely sustained at such high speeds. The primary dangers will be flying debris, falling trees, and potential structural damage, particularly to roofs and windows. He pointed to areas of the map. Properties on the western and northwestern edges of the development will bear the brunt of the initial impact. Thomas wasn't surprised to see that Diane and Richard's home fell squarely in that highest risk zone, just beyond where his windbreak had provided a buffer all these years. After the official briefing, as people broke into neighborhood groups to coordinate preparations, Eleanor Greenberg settled into the chair beside Thomas. "Quite the day you've had," she remarked. Thomas nodded. "Not how I expected it to go." "Richard's a decent man," Eleanor said. "Always has been. Just too busy with his career to notice what Hurricane Diane was stirring up in the neighborhood." She tapped her cane thoughtfully. "You know, 15 years ago, before your house was even built, the developer planned a community windbreak along that whole northwestern edge. Diane led the charge against it, said it would ruin the mountain views and lower property values." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "So if that had been built, the entire neighborhood would be better protected tomorrow," Eleanor finished. "Ironic, isn't it?" As the meeting wound down, Richard approached Thomas. "Mr. Ellis," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to apologize personally for the situation with your trees. The board will be conducting a full review of all bylaw changes made in the past year." "I appreciate that," Thomas replied. "How's Diane taking everything?" Richard sighed. She's processing. Refused to come tonight. Says she's going to stay with her sister in Denver until this blows over. Both the storm and the HOA situation. Thomas glanced out the window, where the sky was already darkening despite it being hours before sunset. Is she leaving tonight? That was her plan, but with this weather coming in, Richard checked his watch. I should call her. Make sure she's not on the road when this hits. By the time Thomas returned home, the wind was already picking up, whistling through his windbreak trees with an eerie melody. He spent the evening securing loose items in his yard, checking his emergency supplies, and filling containers with water in case the power went out. He just finished when his phone rang. Martin Chen again. Have you seen the HOA Facebook page? Martin asked without preamble. Thomas hadn't. He opened his laptop to find a flurry of activity on the community page. Asterisk, Diane Harrington's car is still in her driveway. Has anyone heard from her? Richard is stuck in Denver, flight canceled due to weather. Asterisk. Asterisk just drove by the Harrington house. Lights are on, but no answer at the door. Asterisk. Asterisk 911 is getting swamped with calls ahead of the storm. They're sending someone to check, but it might be a while. Asterisk. Thomas frowned. Has anyone tried calling her cell? Goes straight to voicemail, Martin replied. Richard's worried. Apparently, they had an argument after she got home, and she told him she was leaving immediately for her sister's. He's been trying to reach her for hours. Thomas looked out his window toward where the Harrington house would be, though he couldn't see it through the trees and gathering darkness. I'll head over there, he said finally. It's not that far. The wind nearly knocked Thomas off his feet as he stepped outside. Rain hadn't started yet, but the air felt heavy with its promise. He took his truck rather than walking, partly for speed and partly because he didn't fancy being on foot if the storm hit early. The Harrington house was illuminated but felt empty somehow. Diane's white SUV sat in the circular driveway, packed with luggage visible through the windows. Thomas rang the doorbell 3 times, then pounded on the door, but received no answer. Dawn broke over whispering pines with the gentle pink and gold hues that often follow violent storms, as if nature were apologizing for its tantrum. Thomas woke on the Harrington's couch to the sound of chainsaws and generators in the distance. His phone showed a weak signal, just enough to send a text to his closest neighbors confirming he was safe. Diane appeared in the doorway looking disheveled but more alert than the night before. The cut on her forehead had scabbed over, and she changed into jeans and a sweatshirt, an outfit Thomas would never have imagined her wearing. Coffee, she offered, holding up a French press. Camp stove still works. They took their mugs to the front door, which Thomas had to force open against debris piled on the porch. What lay beyond stopped them both in their tracks. The Harringtons' front yard was unrecognizable. All 5 of the tall cypress trees that had lined the driveway were down, 2 across the drive itself, 1 through the living room window, and 2 more collapsed against the house's facade. The meticulously manicured lawn was strewn with branches, roofing tiles, and fragments of the ceramic planters that had adorned the front walkway. The fountain centerpiece that had featured in last year's garden showcase lay in pieces, and the ornate mailbox had vanished entirely. But it was the backyard that had taken the worst hit. From their vantage point on the porch, they could see that the pergola had collapsed, crushing Diane's award-winning rose garden beneath it. The koi pond had been filled with debris, and not a single one of the specimen trees remained standing. What had once been the neighborhood's showpiece garden now resembled a war zone. "Oh my God," Diane whispered, her coffee forgotten in her hand. Thomas stood silent beside her, taking in the extent of the destruction. In the distance, he could see other homes with damage, shingles missing, fences down, a trampoline wrapped around a streetlight, but nothing on the scale of what had happened here on the northwestern edge of the development. They were still standing there when the first emergency vehicles began making their way down the street, clearing paths through fallen branches and debris. Richard Harrington was in the first police cruiser, having apparently pulled strings to get a ride, and as soon as the roads were passable, he rushed to Diane, embracing her with visible relief. "The news is saying this was the worst windstorm in 30 years, Richard said, surveying the damage to their home. They're calling it a land hurricane. Half the county is without power." Diane nodded absently, still staring at the ruins of her garden. "How's the rest of the neighborhood?" "Varied," Richard replied. "The eastern sections got off relatively lightly, some roof damage, lots of debris. But this western edge," he gestured to the surrounding homes, all showing significant damage. "This side took the full force." Thomas checked his phone, which now had better signal. "I should get back to my place, see how it fared." "I'll drive you," Richard offered immediately. "It's the least I can do after you stayed with Diane." The drive that normally took 2 minutes stretched to 15 as they navigated around fallen trees, emergency vehicles, and crews already at work clearing the main roads. As they turned onto Thomas's street, the contrast became immediately apparent. While there was certainly debris scattered across yards and a few fence panels down, the houses themselves appeared largely intact. And as they pulled up to Thomas's home, the reason was obvious. His windbreak, while battered and missing a few trees, had stood firm against the worst of the storm. The line of trees had done exactly what it was designed to do, disrupting the wind flow and creating a zone of relative calm behind it. Thomas's property showed minimal damage. Some shingles displaced, a garden shed leaning, and branches down across the yard. But structurally, his house and the neighboring properties, sheltered behind his tree line, had weathered the storm remarkably well. Richard let out a low whistle. "Would you look at that?" Thomas said nothing, letting the evidence speak for itself. "Thank you again," Richard said as Thomas got out. "For everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found Diane when you did." Thomas nodded. Neighbors look out for each other, even when they disagree.